Welcome to Insightful Leaders. I'm your host, Ryan Stewart, and this is a show where I interview proven leaders in the customer insights and customer experience space who share their stories, strategies, and insights to drive meaningful change at your organization. I'm very excited to introduce you all to TS Balaji. TS, as most people call him, is an experienced design and SaaS executive with a track record of creating and leading design and product groups. He's a strategist with a talent for quickly identifying new technologies, spotting trends, pioneering business models, and utilizing them to innovate and advocate on behalf of customers. He currently leads the service design and customer experience team for Coxs. Great to have you on the show, TS.
Thank you, Ryan. Great introduction. I should have you as my intro guy everywhere.
I'll add that to my list of side hustles. TS, your official title at Coxs is, as we just covered off, right, VP of Experience Design and Customer Experience. Mm-hmm. Can you talk me through how you define those two different aspects of that title, namely experience design and customer experience?
Yeah, I grew up as a designer, and when I think about design, I think about a future that doesn't exist. So most designers, whether they talk about this or not, they believe in create a future that has not been articulated in meaningful ways for people to understand. So that becomes the design aspect of the job. I think about customer experience more in terms of the here and now. So if you start thinking about what customers are going through today, and how do you help solve for issues that they may be facing, regardless of the industry that you live in, right? So, and that's how I think and approach those two titles in the job. And it has various different facets, as you can imagine, when it relates to design and what it means to lead customer experience in different parts of Europe.
Yeah, and on that, at Coxs specifically, what is the business unit responsible for?
Yeah, so Coxs is a privately held company. So the division that I'm part of is the largest privately held telecommunication company. But apart from this unit, Coxs also has a division called Coxs Auto, which houses roughly about, let's say, 20 different brands, inclusive of Auto Trader, Kelly Blue Book, etc. So that's the entirety of the company. And I'm in the telco side of the business. And within the telco side of the business, you can start to think of your internet service, TV, phone, etc., as the core part of our residential services. And then we have a commercial side to that, which apart from focusing on connectivity, also has other SaaS offerings that they go to market with. So that's the telco side of the business in a nutshell.
Can you talk to me about what's the value that you see of having a completely centralized end-to-end function in an organization responsible for understanding the entire customer journey?
I'll take this a couple of different ways. So you're talking about the value of something being centralized. I also want to talk about the value of something not being centralized, right? So when do you go with centralized and when do you not go with centralized? As a general principle, when I think about orgs, I think through the lens of value creation for your stakeholders, and you have a strategy that ends up and helps create that value, and then your organization is essentially set up in that way. And in some instances, and this is regarding any discipline that you take, right? In some instances, organizations may not have the maturity that's needed for a function to reside distributed within the organization, or more importantly, distributed as part of the culture of the organization. And in those situations are when I think about an organization that is centralized. And in this case, you could think of customer experience being centralized or consumer insights being centralized. And then there are other instances where you're so customer centric as a culture that you don't even need to have customer experience as a department. That it is part and parcel of what you do in every aspect of your job, whether you're creating a product, you're selling, you're servicing a customer, you're marketing, whatever the case might be. And in those instances, you can think of it, the DNA of that organization having customer centricity baked into it, that you're not going to need a centralized organization to be more customer centric. Right. So, and the underlying assumption there is customer experience is about inducing customer centricity into the organization and the processes that you follow, whether that be in terms of creating a service, creating a product, servicing a customer, marketing to customers, etc. Right. So you can take that realm, and in that value equation, you can start to think about, okay, an organization needs to have a centralized department like customer experience when that value is not baked into your DNA or your culture. And that becomes a critical component of how you can start to think about the value that you bring. And then that creates a set of artifacts and your work outputs and inputs that start to define your department. And it also allows for customer experience to morph into other things as the company matures through the life cycle, right? It's a bit of a clinical answer, but this is how I think about things, and it allows me to set up organizations in a sustainable way so that it can run without me being there as the creator of that organization, right? So that's how I think about it.
Interesting. On the culture side, I think it's often spoken about that, it's hard to change culture once you get past a certain number of employees, right? And, I've heard numbers as low as 20. Once you pass 20 employees, it's very hard to change the direction of the culture. What do you think of the statement then, if we take that as being true, that if you find yourself in a situation that you do have to have a centralized customer experience department, that you're going to have that department forevermore because the culture is impossible to change, basically? I'm sure it's possible to change it at the fringes, but possible to change the real DNA of the organization.
Yeah, and in that context, you're going to need to start to think about customer experience as a centralized organization having multiple different facets, everything from influencing culture to being a catalyst to being customer centric to how do you start making customer centricity be part of the work input that that happens within the organization to how do you then create services and products that are more customer centric, and you start to operate and create functional groups that bring in different expertise to enable those things, right? And in that context, you can start to think about it as if that is not part of your DNA, then you can start to think about research, design, and policies and implementation of said policies, depending on the kind of org and the size of the org, to name a few different components of what could be customer experience within the context of an organization, right? but you can start to compartmentalize this into components of, okay, where do we start to understand the maturity of, right, design? Where do we start to understand the maturity of research? How do we make decisions? Are they based on insights that are coming from customer-centric components of the org or of the data sets that you're collecting? How do you then focus on hiring to the aspects of service development and product development through those lenses? And you can now start to create a matrix of how do we get to different levels of maturity across these pillars, if you may, right? And that becomes your charter and your journey of what becomes centralized. And then maybe there are some components of it becomes decentralized and other components come into being centralized, right? So that becomes, in my mind, centered to individual organizations and individual cultures rather than a cookie cutter of, hey, apply this everywhere kind of situation. And certainly I approach it with that mindset in terms of creating orgs such as customer experience and experience design.
And if an organization has a kind of decentralized customer experience team, this idea that, customer centricity and customer experience is baked into all of the different sub departments of an organization, do you feel like it's then, necessary, or have you seen it very often where these sub departments will almost be KPI'd or asked to track their customer centricity or their customer experience or the outcomes they're delivering for customers?
I'll say this. I'm not sure I can name the company that I know that doesn't have customer experience as a department. And I was fascinated in understanding that culture. And it's in the retail side of the business. In any NPS study that you have seen about customer centricity or customer experience, they are in the top one or two, right? And they don't have an official customer experience group, and they do not have an internal KPI that aligns to an NPS or a customer sat. And I found that fascinating. And yet they are the top ranked company, like companies of companies, right? Like not just retailers, right? So I'm just giving that example to say that it is possible. It is possible to have that kind of a culture, right? And in those cases, it is also possible not to focus on customer-centric KPIs as we know it today, right? And this is where I think KPIs in general is fascinating to me, where, most companies, when they think about customer experience, first they think about a survey, and most likely they implement or initiate an organization that focuses on getting feedback from customers through the method of survey, and then using that survey to solve for customer problems, issues, and opportunities through the lens of standard inner loop, outer loop kind of ecosystem for operating that. But if I was king of the world and I was creating a company, I would love to induce it into the culture where the KPIs are business measures in such a way that it gives me a lead measure view into what is the experience that customers are having, rather than having to survey them to find out how customers are experiencing my product, my company, my service, etc. Right? Um, Obviously, I'm not king of the world. Obviously, this
You're
is a
kidding.
hypothetical, right? But all I'm trying to point out there is the idea of KPIs and the idea of customer-centric KPIs is something that um, I love to explore deeply because every aspect or every vertical in a business community that you can think of um, has its own set of KPIs that you could use as a proxy um, for understanding how customers are experiencing that said business, right? And I think that's where the opportunity lies for customer experience as an industry, because we're having a moment in the world right at this moment. And I don't know if you read the news, but the Biden administration just announced something about focusing on customer experience and service delivery for the American people, which is a fascinating step in the world, right? And you can start to see where uh, uh, that kind of idea is being birthed into a federal government, um, and it certainly feels like the discipline as a whole is having its moment or is arriving or has arrived when things like that happen.
Yeah, I mean, surely government's got to be that stereotype of the slowest moving machine in known existence. So if they're focusing on customer experience, then absolutely there must be some shifts in the wind. You mentioned surveys, so and something that I've been heard mentioned a whole lot recently, even in the last 6 months, it's felt like it's kind of increased. Is this idea of survey fatigue and customers just being surveyed. It seems like at every turn you're being surveyed. I get my groceries, I'm getting surveyed. It's just never ending. Um, what can we do about that? It feels like what you're alluding to there was there's other ways to try and measure how you're performing with customers that can be, from the customer's lens, be considered to be more passive. You're kind of using the interactions that the customer's having with your organization to inform how you're doing without being explicit in asking them for feedback. But I also imagine that you're also saying, I assume you're not saying that surveys don't have a place. I assume there's some sort of middle ground there.
Yeah, so let me start by saying, and I've talked about this a ton, there's no replacing um, feedback that customers can directly give to you that talks about how they feel about an experience. I'm not suggesting that we replace that. I'm thinking more in terms of um, can we use that as a lag measure? Can we use survey as a way in which we can ascertain something when we have no other way to get at that information, right? Um, so the fundamental question that we should be asking first is, why are we surveying index? What would we do differently as an organization that we're not doing today if we get this question answered by the customer, right? Um, and if it is about, um, I want to keep tabs on my employee to see if he or she did their job well, that's a whole different story, right? Because I can give you examples of, um, I had a plumbing issue in my house not too long ago, and I had a plumber come in, and in fact, I had 3 different plumbing companies come in to solve that problem, one after the other, and um, each instance, the moment the person completed the job, I got a survey from them that said, how did so-and-so did, right? And if it is about keeping tabs on that plumber doing their jobs, look, I'm not an expert at plumbing, but almost each one of these individuals who came into my home spent close to 6 to 7 hours trying to solve the problem. And the first two did not successfully solve the problem, even though I wouldn't have known immediately. And my answer to that question was always, yes, fantastic. This person worked so hard. And I could see the sweat, and like this guy was doing something in trying to solve the issue. And it, like they did by the time they went home. And, 72 hours later, I had to call the next plumber. And the same story with the next plumber, right? So that's why I ask, like, why are we asking the question from the customer, right? Because 72 hours later, I placed a phone call telling them they didn't solve the problem, right? So that in and of itself is a good feedback mechanism. And 9 out of 10 times, I would have accepted that person coming back and fixing the issue. But in this instance, when I told them the issue is not resolved, the person who took care of the issue couldn't come back to resolve it, and they gave me a date that was another 72 hours away, and I just couldn't live without plumbing in my house. And I was already living with 2 kids in a Marriott nearby, right? And that, like, in that interaction, you can know a lot about, did you solve the problem? And you could know a lot about if the particular individual solved the problem. And so asking the why question is important. And designing a survey in trying to answer that why is even more important. And thinking about the experience that the customer is going to have in that context is probably one of the least exercised rights by companies and customer experience departments, is thinking about how is this customer going to have this experience of just replying to the survey that we're asking, right? And those are all opportunities. And the same thing happened with when I had to fix my garage door, right? And we see this example in airports where airport toilets have the feedback mechanism with the smiley faces and the frowny faces, right? And if the goal is to find if a toilet is leaking, I feel like we're getting onto a plumbing kind of conversation here, but but if the goal is to determine if something is leaking in the toilet in the airport, there are other ways to get at it than just asking your customers to tell you if through the frowny face or smiley face to see if happening in that toilet, right? So that's just one example, and you could get into any other business, right? And say this, right? So if I'm using Capiche and there is an outage on Capiche, you're going to know 9 out of 10 times before I know about it, right? You shouldn't have to ask me to there's an outage. You shouldn't have to ask me that I was using Capiche for, right? All of that is available to you, right? Like that survey is not helping in the context of finding outage type issues. But on the other hand, if you're trying to figure out relationship if you're trying to find out about your pricing, all of those things where there's not an easy way for you to find an answer other than to trial and error different things, right? You could employ other methodologies. So the net answer where I'm going with this is use survey not as I'm going to use it as the only tool that's available to me to get customer feedback, but rather use it as a very precious tool that you have in your toolkit, and use it sparingly, especially in a world where your plumber, your garage door repair person, your handyman, everyone is surveying the individual that you consider as a customer. So that's the context in which I think about this.
The software example is interesting because, like, when you think that through, and of course it's obvious in the world of software, but basically what you're saying is if a piece of software that you're using goes down and then the software company is surveying you to say, hey, is our software down? You probably couldn't think of many things as infuriating as an experience like that. And we're just not accustomed to dealing with software companies like that. We know that they should know better, and we know that they shouldn't have to survey us. So I wonder if it's a case of that expectation of the type of experience we're going to get with different organizations to lean into the plumbing trend with our plumber. We kind of expect them to know that things didn't go well and not ask us how well did it go. And if I can imagine a world where if organizations aren't adapting to figuring out how to do that themselves, you're actually going to be damaging the experience that you're delivering to customers by asking them to kind of do the grunt work for you, right? Like you should be able to figure out, Capri should be able to figure out if the software's down. The plumbing organization should be able to figure out if they didn't fix your problem. They're simply outsourcing the work to you to try and short circuit the work that they have to do and perhaps provide efficiencies on whether they're delivering on the promise that they said that they would.
Right, exactly. And let's go more into the software world, right? Most of us use a collaboration and communication tool like a Zoom, like a Teams, like a GoToMeeting, etc. And almost universally, there's a rating system at the end of the meeting, right? And there's a questionnaire that says, would you recommend? There's a question that says, how was your meeting? Whatever the case might be, right? It ranges depending on the company you're dealing with. And the question that I would ask is, don't you know already from the session information if you drop packets? You probably know if I had audio issues already, right? And why are you asking that question? Now, if you're asking that question to confirm that there was a bad audio quality in the meeting, that's a whole different ball of wax, right? But your primary goal is to find if there was an issue, or use that to find or investigate, or use that as a signal to investigate in the plethora of data that you collect. Now I have issues with that. Right?
Yeah, and I almost guarantee you they're using it to try train something to pick up when there is issues. And when I think about my usage of those systems, I only ever use that survey when it didn't go well, and I almost universally hit the frowny face. And I think your point's interesting because I have no doubt that they can tell when a call hasn't gone well. And if the purpose of the survey is to just sanity check that their own diagnosis is correct, the question wouldn't be rate the call. The question would be, hey, we feel like you had issues on this call and that we didn't deliver the service that you wanted. Is that correct?
Spot on, right? And that's exactly what I'm trying to point out is, in that particular instance, it feels more like you understand the situation that I was just in, and you're trying to confirm whether your understanding of the situation I was in is actually true, If yes, then you do something about it, right? You would make your software better, or you would try to um, unpack and find out where the root causes are for that issue, right? And the second aspect of the surveying and the inner loop and outer loop um, that I want people to focus on, which is focus on the root cause, right? Um, so asking that question as a confirmation of the signal is the first step, right? The second step is to make sure that that issue that is truly causing that doesn't ever happen again, ever, for any customers utilizing your software, right? And if you use your feedback mechanism in that way, now all of a sudden, that feedback mechanism is part and parcel of your product. It's part and parcel of how you deliver the experience. And you're thinking about the experience that the customer is having, and you're using your software to understand that particular aspect of it. And you're able to solve the said issue in meaningful ways. Now, going back to your first question, you can start thinking about what does a centralized organization do in those situations? And wouldn't we want to have a triad working on that in a software company that's focused on analyzing those issues? And you probably want someone who's um, a software engineer going deep into understanding the root cause of the said issue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So you can start to see how all of these things are so interconnected in terms of your approach for your product, your strategy for the services that you deliver, your feedback mechanism, what you use to get that feedback, etc., and how you structure the organization as a result of that.
Yeah, I'm almost willing to bet in a software organization that would ultimately end up living in a growth team, which is a whole other discussion. Something that I wanted to mention was it feels like now is the perfect time, right? All of the interactions, not all, but the vast majority of interactions that customers are having with organizations are being digitized, right? And that means that these organizations have access in a digital format to all of this data that they never really had access to before, which means that you should be able to rely on a little less the surveys and a little more on all the other signals that are being provided to you without, having to go through the rigmarole of trying to digitize those data sources.
Completely agree. Now you're speaking my language, right? And now you can start to utilize that same data in interesting ways to help set up scores that are coming from that data set that start to mimic and look like your survey results, right? So for instance, the examples that I would use are, let's say, in a someone's using a software and they need to join a meeting, and they're not able to join the meeting. They try to troubleshoot it. They are not able to troubleshoot it, and then they end up calling, and then it gets resolved by whatever the person on the other side said the customer to go do, right? So in that equation, the idea of a customer trying to join a meeting is already capped in some capacity on your software. And you're able to understand what could have caused that issue, or at least that there was an issue. Now you start to realize that that same customer ends up calling you to address that issue. Now you can start to unpack that to say, okay, what if I use that data set to say, if a customer is able to solve that problem all by themselves, I will weight that at a lower end of the spectrum than when they have to call us, because the effort involved in calling is much higher after trying to solve it all by themselves. And as a result, that is a problem and that we need to solve and focus on immediately. And maybe we create an effort index that helps us understand, based on the combination thereof, that as the index gets higher, because the effort is higher for the customer, those are problem areas that we need to focus immediately, right? And as the effort gets to be lower, those are a second set of priority, understanding that you don't have unlimited capacity to go solve for these things in meaningful ways. So then you could use that same data to then say, okay, how did the customer end up trying to solve that problem all by themselves, right? Was there something within the product documentation, or did they go to a site trying to search for how to solve for X, Y, or Z? And how useful was the content that was being presented from the said site or from the support system that starts to unpack how you approach your content strategy for your support of the site, right? So the same data set, now you're able to unpack and utilize in different parts of your organization to help resolve issues, not only for the customer, but also create purpose behind what the organization is supposed to do, right? So someone who is writing content, they can look at that content and go, okay, a customer read this, they still didn't solve the problem, and then they ended up calling us. Let's go listen to the call and see what happened, right? Or let's go talk to agents and see what kinds of issues are customers saying they're having when they come into, and what portion of my content here doesn't resonate with the customer that they have to now call, right? Now you can start to rewrite the content, or now you can focus on, if it is on the product side of the equation, you can start to say, okay, why is this problem happening? What is it that we can do from a software standpoint to rewrite the software so that this problem never happens again, right? So that creates another story to run on a sprint to go solve for the product side of the house, right? And if you're starting to look at the customer success, et cetera, like that same data can be used for each of these departments so that they could be successful in their jobs, right? And that is an opportunity that needs to get harvested and utilized by the company as a whole, as opposed to, you could start seeing where you'll see a survey, is coming from the growth team. That's a survey that's coming from the support team, or a survey that's coming from the customer success team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the reality of fairly large organizations where maybe things aren't centralized, going back to your first question, right? And the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, or they are not focusing on the data sets that they already have, where they don't have to ask the customer the same question, 5 different ways, and put them in the situation where they're fatigued with the surveys that are headed.
And if you've managed to implement surveys such that they're a lagging indicator of effort or success, or however you want to define it for the customer, you then have this really synchronous system where this predictive score that you're churning out to say, hey, this is what we think the effort was that the customer had to go on based on all the data that we're seeing. You can correlate that to the lagging effort score indicator that you get from a survey to see how strongly correlated those two scores are. And you can kind of self-correct, right, to see if you're on the right track in terms of your own internal scoring and predictions.
Spot on. And to add on to that, if you have the prediction coming from a machine learning or an AI-based system, now you can start to utilize your surveys more of a learning component as opposed to a true lag measure, right? Where you can say it with confidence that the lead measure is the only measure that we are going to need in the long run. And we will continue to do the surveys, but that is purely for the learning algorithm that we're implementing where these predictive scores are getting churned, right? And of course, the next step especially if you're a software company, is to be able to predict when that experience is going to go downhill, right? And use that to either be in a situation where you could self-heal through the software itself, or you find yourself in a place where you have to fall back to human intervention, and maybe that human intervention is on your side as opposed to the customer side, right? And the last step might be human intervention by the customer themselves, because the problem is something that you have no control over.
As someone that has a little bit of experience in ML and AI, I would encourage people to make sure there's some sort of feedback loop to make sure that prediction doesn't go AWOL. To stick on the theme of quoting the news, there was an article recently about a real estate company who was algorithmically buying houses and got themselves into a bit of a tangle where the algorithm was buying houses for $200,000 more and then offering it back to the person they bought it from 2 months later. So you want to make sure that the AI doesn't run wild. But yes, I think it does sound like a fantastic nirvana. I wanted to get into how you see the difference. I mean, I've heard you speak about in this podcast so far, I've heard you talk about insights, I've heard you talk about research, I've heard you talk about customer experience. How do you see the difference between customer experience and insights and research? Are they the one and the same thing? Are they different disciplines? How do you think those things relate to each other?
So you said insights, experience, and what is the last one?
Research, which I think you could kind of consider just to be a kind of almost a specialization or a synonym for insights.
So the way I think about these things, and consumer insights or behavioral science or just user research in general, if you start to think about these things in terms of the tasks that they perform, the end goal is to create insights or nuggets of information that someone can use to either solve an unsolved problem or confirm that the hypothesis that you had going into the analysis was essentially true or false, right? And there are different aspects to those, right? So you do research for different purposes. You do research to understand what price a said widget should go for in the marketplace, and you're setting price and you're doing research on pricing, right? So needed function, right? User experience research focuses on understanding usability issues and experience issues that customers are having so that you could reimagine or refactor your experience in meaningful ways. So needed, right? Customer experience research focuses on experience at a higher altitude that transcends different touch points and channels, so that once again you try to solve for issues, right? So the similarities are in the methodologies and the techniques that these different groups use to find those insights, right? So a lot of different organizations have this function centralized, or at least partially centralized under different parts of the org. And I've seen it in product, I've seen it be part of technology, I've seen it be part of marketing, etc. So it is resided in all kinds of different groups, depending on the kind of organization and the size and what is it that they do. For me, I look at it through the lenses of the outcomes that we are hoping to derive from each one of these. And once again, I started the conversation by talking about my approach, philosophy on how I think about value creation, using a strategy, and then to employ that and deploy that strategy for your stakeholders and create value. You create an organizational structure that then focuses on creating that value, right? And in that context, you could approach it in different ways. But ultimately, it's going to depend on the organizational structure and what is it that you're trying to achieve for your stakeholders. That is going to determine whether it's centralized or partly centralized or completely decentralized. Depending on the organization and the strategy, I would have a different answer for the said organization. But in the context of my experience, I have seen it somewhere between partially centralized to completely centralized. I've never seen it completely decentralized in any meaningful way.
Interesting. I'm conscious that we are pushing on an hour soon. I do have one more question for you that I want to ask before we get onto the rapid fire round. And I want to ask this question because I think, we always want to leave people with some actionable advice that they can implement at their own organization. So, you've got a lot of experience with large organizations. What would your advice be for a large organization that wants to become more customer centric, especially those that can see the value but don't quite know where to start?
Yeah, that's fantastic qualification there. And what I would say is, at a minimum, if they understand the value of focusing on your customers, they probably have a value chain understanding of why they want to focus on the customer, right? That would be a given. Otherwise, that's the place that I would ask most people to start. And in my mind, that value chain also has answers to how, as an organization, you approach customer centricity. In 9 out of 10 times in large organizations, apart from getting to the brass tacks of understanding customer journeys, a big portion of and time and energy that gets spent on is storytelling, because you're trying to move a very large organization. I'm assuming somewhere between 30,000 and 200,000 or a million, right? Like depending on the kind of organization. And telling stories from the vantage point of customers sometimes is underappreciated because everyone starts to focus on the raw data and the numbers aspects of customer experience. And it's very easy to focus on that, especially if you're a large organization, especially if you have petabytes of data that you're trying to create insights from, right? But telling those stories are a key method to unpacking and unleashing the power of the organization, right? Especially if you want the entire organization to be customer-centric. Stories about customers and the plight of those customers. We generally talk about issues, but we also want to talk about things that you're doing well, customers, right? That you want to retain in your organization, in your culture. Telling those stories become the most central theme to how you deliver on that promise very quickly, right? Because all the other things that you want to do in terms of creating insights, utilizing data, you either have tools or you have very smart people within your organization that are capable of doing that and would be fantastic at doing. But what I find is seldom there are good storytellers who are able to use that data in meaningful ways to tell real stories about the customers that they are serving to create change within the organization. That would be the one place where I would say focus and create energy around. That could turn around things very quickly, but also it can unleash the power of your entire organization when they start believing in those things.
It's much easier to empathize with the real world story of a customer and the experience that they've had than it is a net promoter score, right?
Yes.
I feel like we could genuinely go on for several more hours, but I'm conscious of time. So I want to move on to the rapid fire question round. So I'm going to run through 5 questions. Rapid fire, I mean, that's kind of just a name. I'm going to do it at regular speed. About customer insights and experience and about yourself. You ready?
I think I'm ready.
Okay. Easy one first. What's the best piece of customer insights or experience advice that you have ever received?
Yeah, so maybe it's cliche to say listen to your customers, but one of the things that this is a true experience. I used to work for a long time back, and one of the stories that I tell people is we were listening to our customers talk about their wireless bill, and one of the phrases that they use was when do my new minutes start? You can understand the era that I'm talking about. People who are focused on their minutes, right? And we didn't quite understand initially what that meant. And, we talk about billing periods as a start of a billing period, ending of a like very technical in terms of how we approach, and probably very sterile, right? And when we heard that, we were like, oh, I see what customers are talking about when they say, when do my new minutes start? And we took that exact phrase and used it on our website to say, this is when your new minutes start, right? So, if you want to think about how listening to your customers actually creates application in the real world, like that's exactly what we did. And that has stuck with me. And to budding designers and researchers and people who are starting in this discipline, that's one of the things that I say is one of the easiest things that you can do is listen to your customers and use the words that they use so that it doesn't have to be yours. And you're going to create empathy to the audience that you're delivering that to. And that is probably the easiest thing that you can do.
Great piece of advice, and a slight segue. This is why I always am a little bit shell-shocked when people think that they can rely on machines to help them understand people and find the answers. Like, I think machines definitely should help you take the low value work off your plate, but it's so important to have people that understand the context of the business and the context of the customer involved in that process to do that interpretation and present it in the right way to the business. There's no way a machine's going to know that people talking about minutes mean billing periods.
Yes. And the thing that I say to people quite often is utilizing machine learning and AI doesn't absolve you of your power of thinking, right? You still have to think. And that is not going to go away, right? And in that context, you could think of your AI and machine learning as your coworker, And in the manufacturing setting, they call them cobots, right? So a robot that works with you, right? And we have to think about AI as something that works with us. And when you think about setting up organizational processes, you think about what is the input, what is the output, and where does it go? What does the workflow look like? And when you're AI, that's a component that you need to think about in terms of input, outputs, downstream, upstream from that machine that's working with you in helping you do your job or a series of people's jobs effectively. So.
Well, to continue the tangent, in an insights and research capacity, I wholeheartedly believe that when it comes to AI and ML, the framing that I like is that it should be removing the low value grunt work off your plate and giving you more space and more time to do the thinking, do the bit that the human's uniquely positioned to do, that the human can uniquely provide value in, not replace the human. And if that's not being met, then I think the entire, to use your analogy, the design of the organizational process is wrong.
Right.
Okay, we're already not rapid fire, but let's continue on. What are you most excited about in the world of customer insights or experience right now?
Going back to what we just talked about, the power of AI, the power of machine learning, and the interesting ways that we're able to utilize it, where the machine helps us understand patterns that I cannot understand through the tools that I have at my disposal and the capacity that I have with my brain. That is super exciting for me, where we can utilize that as a starting point for your research, to go back to your example, where we use machine learning to understand patterns, and to understand those patterns deeply, we then focus on that aspect of customers where we can go talk about that experience that they have and what is so unique in their own words that a machine can understand is unique value for us as an organization, right? Mm-hmm. That marriage is something that we have been exploring for a while at this point, and I think that's rich with opportunities. I'm super excited for both companies as well as startups that are enabling the technology to create those and understand those patterns.
Agreed. What book would you recommend to our audience and why?
Yeah, the book that I'm going to recommend is The Next 100 Years, and it's around geopolitics and strategy. And there's a lot in there about insights, but as it relates to geopolitics. But I see parallels between geopolitics and the approach that author takes in the book Next 100 Years and the work that I do. I never thought it would inspire me in ways that it's been fascinating for me. It's a book that came out a few years back. It's not a new one. And I've cherished it, and I've gone back to it several times.
Yeah, awesome. We'll make sure we put a link in the show notes to where people can find that book. What's an interesting little fun fact about you that most people don't know?
Other than I don't want to talk about myself. Maybe the interesting one, I was telling this story to someone recently. I came to this country as an immigrant for my master's, for my graduate studies, and then I ended up getting into a PhD program. in the US, when you go through a PhD program, you have to take, I think, about 48 or 60 hours of credit hours of coursework. And I filled it up with computer science and statistics, largely because of the topic that I was researching at that time. Little did I know that was going to be super helpful in the career that I have today.
Yes.
Because that was a unexpected, happy coincidence that I have the career I have today, and I don't think I could have it without those years that I spent taking 8 a.m. classes in stats and computer science.
Yeah, interesting. If folks want to get in touch with you, TS, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the easiest way. I'll be happy to respond to people on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to connect with folks and talk to them.
Amazing. Well, I'll make sure that we put your link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. TS, thanks for joining us today. That's been super insightful. And like I said, I feel like we could have gone for another hour or two, so maybe we'll have to look to do it again. I really appreciate the background and insight that you have into this space. Clearly, very knowledgeable. So thank you.
I really appreciate the time and offer to come into the show and do this. Really appreciate it. Thank you, guys.